The gates of the internment compound creaked open at dawn. The air was thick with the smell of rust, sweat, and burning coconut husks. It was May 1945, somewhere on the Philippine island of Luzon. The war was grinding to its last brutal months, and behind those bamboo fences, dozens of Japanese nurses and clerks, female prisoners of war, waited in stunned silence. They had been told that the Americans were devils, that capture meant torture or dishonor. But when the first olive-drab trucks rolled through the mist, what they saw shattered everything they'd been taught. The U.S. soldiers moved slowly, weapons slung low, eyes wary but soft. Some were barely 20, faces pale beneath the tropical sun. Their boots crunched against the gravel as they advanced toward the camp's heart. The women flinched instinctively, expecting shouts, blows, humiliation. None came. Instead, an American medic raised his hands and said through an interpreter, "We're here to get you out." U.S. Army Medical Corps Field Diary, May 1945. The moment defied propaganda. Months earlier, Imperial Japanese Army instructors had lectured every nurse and typist bound for overseas duty. Capture is a fate worse than death. Americans are beasts. Japanese Army Nurse Corps Manual, 1944. Yet these same women now watched soldiers distribute canteens of clean water, medical kits, and ration tins stamped U.S. Army. One young nurse, Lieutenant Akisato, later recalled how the smell of chocolate nearly made her cry. "It was the first time I had smelled sweetness in 3 years," she wrote after the war. Post-war diary of Lieutenant Akisato, 1948. The rescue operation that morning was part of a larger pattern spreading across the Pacific, the collision between myth and reality, between indoctrination and mercy. For years, both sides had fought with relentless hatred. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, jungle battlefields had consumed men by the thousands. Yet here, in this forgotten corner of Luzon, the war momentarily paused, not for a ceasefire, but for an act of humanity. To understand this surreal encounter, one must trace the chain of events that led these women to the Philippines. In late 1942, Tokyo's Ministry of War began transferring auxiliary female personnel, nurses, clerks, typists, and translators, to the forward medical and administrative units in the South Pacific. They were assigned to the 14th Area Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, a commander whose reputation for cunning and ferocity had terrified Allied planners. Imperial Japanese Army Personnel Orders, 1942. When the Americans launched their counteroffensive in late 1944, Operation Musketeer and the liberation of Luzon, the Japanese defense crumbled faster than expected. Units were cut off, communications shattered, and the surviving medical detachments retreated deep into the mountains. By early 1945, many female support staff had been captured or surrendered. Those who refused often perished from starvation or suicide, victims of the psychological warfare their own government had instilled. The scene at the Luzon camp symbolized more than rescue. It was a confrontation between two realities, a culture of total war and the humanitarian code of the Geneva Conventions, which Japan had never fully ratified. For American troops, encountering Japanese women in uniform, alive and terrified, was deeply disorienting. Many had just come from bloody firefights, in which surrender was rare and mercy rarer still. "We didn't know what to do at first," recalled Sergeant Robert Rains of the 25th Infantry Division. "We expected them to fight. Instead, they just bowed and cried." U.S. Army Oral History Collection, 1946. What made this moment extraordinary was its timing. Just weeks earlier, U.S. forces had stormed the island fortress of Corregidor under intense artillery fire. The victory had cost thousands of lives. Every man there carried memories of comrades mutilated or ambushed under white flags. The propaganda had worked both ways. Americans were told that surrender to Japan meant torture or beheading. The Pacific War had become one of annihilation, where mercy was a liability. And yet, in this single morning, mercy prevailed. As the American medics tended to malnourished prisoners, a field cameraman documented the event on 16mm film. Shaky, sun-washed footage of nurses in torn khaki skirts, faces hollow yet defiant. The film would later be screened to war correspondents in Manila. Under the caption, "Japanese POW Nurses, Luzon, May 1945, U.S. Army Signal Corps Film Unit," Reel 23B, but the footage would never be widely shown to the American public. War Office censors feared it might evoke sympathy for the enemy, complicating the black and white narrative of the Pacific Campaign. For the Japanese, the images were equally taboo. The concept of Onahei, women soldiers, surrendering alive, clashed violently with the myth of heroic death. Even decades later, few official Japanese histories would acknowledge their existence. In the camp's shadowed infirmary, American medics discovered makeshift surgical tools crafted from mess tins and bayonets, evidence of the women's desperate improvisation as supplies vanished. One U.S. doctor wrote, "These girls had treated wounded soldiers with almost no medicine. They kept them alive on boiled rice water." U.S. Army Medical Report, June 1945. He noted the ingenuity of their sterilization method, heating scalpels in melted kerosene lamps. That technical creativity, born of necessity, mirrored what Allied engineers were perfecting back home, field innovation under fire. But even as the rescue unfolded, far away in Tokyo, Japanese radio broadcasts still blared slogans of resistance. Women were told to fight with bamboo spears, to die rather than submit. To be captured alive was to be erased. That's why when American jeeps first arrived, many of the nurses tried to hide their faces in shame. "We expected execution," one survivor told an interviewer decades later. "Instead, they gave us cigarettes." NHK Oral History Series, 1972. For the U.S. soldiers, the discovery of female prisoners forced a moral reckoning. After years of total warfare, firebombings, kamikazes, island massacres, here was a human contradiction. These women were not the faceless enemy from propaganda reels. They were frightened, starving, yet dignified. Some spoke English. Some asked about their brothers in Burma or New Guinea. And when the soldiers realized that several of the women had been trained as nurses by the Red Cross before the war, the irony was almost unbearable. As night fell, the Americans distributed blankets and rations. The women huddled together, whispering prayers, not to die, but in disbelief that they were still alive. Outside, the jungle hummed with cicadas. In the distance, artillery flashes lit the horizon where other battles still raged. The war was far from over, but for these women, it had already ended in a way they never imagined. Not with fire or glory, but with rescue. The next morning, an American officer recorded the prisoners' names, ranks, and serial numbers. When he reached the end of the list, he looked up and said quietly, "You're safe now." The interpreter hesitated, searching for the right words. When the message reached them in Japanese, several women began to sob uncontrollably. They weren't supposed to cry before the enemy, but they did. U.S. Army POW processing log, May 1945. For the Americans, it was another day in the Pacific Campaign. For the Japanese nurses, it was the end of a lifetime of indoctrination. In their eyes, the enemy had become something impossible, merciful. And as the trucks rolled away, carrying them toward field hospitals and interrogation centers, the sun broke through the low clouds. The light fell across their faces, revealing expressions not of hatred or pride, but of stunned, fragile relief. What none of them knew was that their rescue would set off a quiet chain reaction in Tokyo's intelligence circles. Reports of captured women surviving under American custody would reach the general staff within weeks, causing disbelief, then confusion, then something darker. Because if the stories were true, if American soldiers had shown mercy, then what else had Japan's leaders lied about? The shock that rippled through the Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence channels after the Luzon rescues was immediate and unsettling. Coded intercepts from field commands reported, "Female auxiliary personnel captured alive and treated humanely by U.S. forces." Imperial Japanese Army Signal Intercept, June 1945. For a nation that had taught its soldiers that death was nobler than surrender, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a fracture in ideology itself. But for the Americans, the rescue was only one piece of a much larger pattern, a manifestation of an advantage so deeply rooted in logistics, communications, and medical engineering that it had quietly reshaped the Pacific War. That hidden advantage was mobility and the system of life-saving support that moved with it. From radios to refrigeration, from portable hospitals to field kitchens, the Americans had perfected an art of sustaining men, and now prisoners, thousands of miles from home. The Japanese command, starved of steel and fuel, could not comprehend how the U.S. war machine kept moving like a living organism across oceans. The Luzon rescues were proof of that invisible empire of supply. U.S. Army Quartermaster General Report, 1945. At the heart of this logistical miracle was the concept of the rolling medical chain. Every combat division was backed by a mobile network of evacuation hospitals, surgical trucks and air evacuation units capable of treating casualties within hours of injury. Designed by Colonel Joseph Thurston Martin and perfected by engineers at the Army Medical Department Research and Development Board, these systems turned battlefields into self-sustaining cities. Each 400-bed evacuation hospital could be erected in less than 12 hours, powered by gasoline generators and cooled by compact ammonia refrigeration units developed by Carrier Corporation. Army Medical Bulletin No. 58, 1944. When the Luzon campaign began in January 1945, these mobile hospitals followed the front lines within 48 hours. The same trucks that delivered plasma and penicillin would later carry rescued POWs, including the Japanese nurses, to safety. It was an engineering triumph disguised as compassion. The American war effort's moral image was not accidental. It was built, assembled, and shipped across the Pacific in crates marked U.S. Army Medical Department. For the Japanese, such mobility was inconceivable. Their medical corps still relied on mule transport and improvised bamboo stretchers. Radios, when available, were fragile Type 94 models, hand-cranked and easily jammed by Allied interference. Japanese Army Technical Evaluation Report, 1945. Without coordination, field hospitals were often abandoned and patients left behind. In contrast, U.S. medical and logistical engineers operated as a seamless grid, what one intelligence officer later described as war conducted by telephone and gasoline. U.S. War Department Analysis, 1946. The decisive showcase of this system came not at Luzon's prisons, but during the Battle of Manila, fought from February 3 to March 3, 1945. The confrontation would test the limits of both brutality and mercy. While the Japanese garrison under Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi turned the capital into a fortress of rubble and fire, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur advanced with a precision born from their logistical superiority. Nearly 100,000 Japanese troops and civilians perished. The Americans lost around 1,000 men, yet amid the chaos, their mobile hospitals and evacuation chains remained functional throughout the battle. U.S. Army After Action Report, March 1945. The system's backbone lay in technology. The SCR-300 FM radio, developed by Motorola's engineering team under Daniel E. Noble, allowed platoon leaders to coordinate real-time evacuations. Unlike the unreliable AM sets used by the Japanese, FM signals resisted static and jungle interference. Range 5 miles per unit. Weight 38 pounds. Power 2 1.5-volt dry batteries. Those frequencies carried orders, medical requests, and even rescue confirmations for POWs across shattered city blocks. Technical Manual TM 11242, 1944. Meanwhile, the 3-4-ton Dodge WC-54 ambulance became an unsung hero of the Pacific. Powered by a 92-horsepower inline-6 engine, it could traverse shell-pocked terrain at 50 mph, carrying 4 litter patients or 8 sitting wounded. Over 23,000 units were built between 1942 and 1945 by the Fargo division of Chrysler, each with blackout lights and water-sealed electrical systems for amphibious landings. Ordnance Department Production Report 1945. Every rescue, every humanitarian act witnessed by Japanese prisoners was enabled by these machines and by the anonymous engineers who forged them. In the Philippines alone, nearly 300 field mechanics and technicians from the 13th Quartermaster Corps worked around the clock to keep refrigeration units, generators and ambulances operational in tropical humidity. If the truck stopped, wrote one mechanic, men died. That was the math. Field Maintenance Log, February 1945. During the second week of the Manila campaign, a column from the 37th Infantry Division encountered a small group of Japanese female medical personnel hiding in the basement of a ruined convent near Intramuros. The soldiers were prepared for snipers. What they found instead were frightened nurses tending to wounded civilians. A combat photographer named Thomas Hagel captured the moment. 2 U.S. medics carrying an injured Japanese nurse on a stretcher through smoke and sunlight filtering through shattered stained glass. The photograph was never published during the war. Signal Corps Photo Archive 45 MN 1123. When word reached command headquarters, MacArthur's staff issued explicit orders, all enemy medical personnel to be accorded the protections of the Geneva Convention. General Headquarters Order Number 239, February 1945. Though Japan itself had refused to extend those protections to Allied POWs, the Americans enforced them rigorously as both moral statement and psychological weapon. Every act of mercy was also a message. This is what civilization looks like. To the Japanese soldiers trapped in Manila, such actions were incomprehensible. Reports intercepted after the battle recorded disbelief among captured officers. The Americans aid even our wounded. They must be mad or godlike. Dramatized composite from POW interrogation summaries, March 1945. The propaganda of invincible cruelty was dissolving, replaced by a reluctant respect that would, after surrender, shape Japan's post-war narrative of defeat and redemption. Technically, the victory in Manila was a case study in combined arms efficiency, but beneath that steel logic ran a pulse of human engineering. By March 1945, U.S. hospitals had treated over 21,000 combat casualties and nearly 400 enemy prisoners. The Japanese female POWs from Luzon were among those processed, deloused, and medically rehabilitated in a system designed to restore the enemy before interrogating them. It was warfare by assembly line, but with a paradoxical soul. Inside the mobile hospitals, the nurses, once proud servants of the emperor, witnessed another shock: the machinery of American abundance. Refrigerators filled with plasma bags, electric autoclaves sterilizing instruments automatically, field surgeons using penicillin, a drug still unknown to most Japanese medical officers, to save both Allied and Axis lives. Army Medical Research Laboratory Report 1945. For women trained to fight infection with boiled salt water, it was like witnessing sorcery. One U.S. nurse, Captain Margaret Delaney, wrote in her diary, "They stared at our equipment as if we were from another planet. I realized then we hadn't just beaten them in battle, we'd beaten them in science." Nursing Corps Journal, April 1945. The Japanese POW nurses quietly began assisting in operations, translating for wounded countrymen, or tending to civilian victims. A few even volunteered for medical duties under American supervision, a gesture unthinkable months earlier. Engineers at the base recorded how the Japanese women quickly adapted to using American sterilization and refrigeration units, even suggesting modifications to preserve delicate bandages from humidity. U.S. Army Engineering Service Memo, May 1945. By the time the war reached its final crescendo over Okinawa, the humanitarian machinery perfected in the Philippines was running at full tempo. Each act of mercy broadcast across radio waves, filmed by Signal Corps cameras, and preserved in archival reels that future generations would study, not just as logistics, but as ideology in motion. For the Americans, their technological mastery had created something beyond victory. It had manufactured moral credibility. For the Japanese women who witnessed it firsthand, the illusion of divine empire crumbled not under bombs, but under compassion delivered by machines. And yet, for all its precision, the system had a darker side. Every truck of medicine meant another convoy of bombs. Every act of rescue was balanced by the destruction of entire cities. The same steel arteries that carried plasma to Luzon would soon carry atomic components to Tinian. In that contradiction lay the final question these women would confront. How could a nation capable of such mercy also unleash such annihilation? The answer would arrive months later in blinding light over Hiroshima. And with it, the ultimate revelation of America's hidden advantage, August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the sky tore open. The blast wave flattened the city in seconds. For the Japanese nurses rescued months earlier in Luzon, now held in American custody at medical facilities in Leyte and Guam, news of the atomic bombing arrived through translators who struggled to find the right words. They sat in stunned silence, hands clasped over their mouths. The same Americans who had fed them, healed them, and treated them with compassion had unleashed a weapon that erased an entire city. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The contradiction haunted them, and it would haunt the world. Yet within that paradox lay the true evolution of warfare in the 20th century, power and mercy intertwined, industry as both savior and destroyer. The war had revealed that humanity's fate was no longer decided solely by soldiers, but by engineers, scientists, and logistics officers operating far from the front lines. In the months after Japan's surrender, American psychological assessment teams began interviewing prisoners of war, including the female nurses from Luzon. Their testimonies became part of the Allied effort to understand the Japanese mindset, how a nation so disciplined and loyal could collapse so completely once the illusion of divine invincibility shattered. The mercy of the Americans destroyed more faith than their bombs, wrote one analyst. Psychological Warfare Division Report, 1946. For many of the nurses, captivity had become a strange classroom. They had seen both the brutality of total war and the strange dignity of the enemy. Under American care, they gained weight, learned English phrases, and assisted in the treatment of Filipino civilians wounded by Japanese artillery. One nurse, identified in records only as Sergeant Y. Takahashi, reportedly asked her American counterpart, "If we had treated your wounded, would you have spared us?" The answer was immediate, yes. Allied POW Interrogation Transcript 1945. The American doctrine of mercy wasn't mere sentiment, it was strategic. Commanders understood that every rescued POW, every medical treatment extended to an enemy, was a psychological weapon as potent as any shell. It undermined the enemy's indoctrination, eroded their will to die for an emperor who could not protect them. The Luzon rescues became a case study at the Army's Civil Affairs School at Charlottesville in 1946, used to illustrate the practical benefits of humanitarian conduct. U.S. War Department Educational Memo, 1946. Meanwhile, Japan's own post-war scholars would later analyze these encounters with painful introspection. Historians like Saburo Yenaga and Kiyoshi Nakasone wrote that the American display of humanity struck at the heart of the Japanese military code, Bushido turned inside out. To be treated kindly by the enemy was paradoxically the most devastating defeat of all. "They took our pride," one former nurse lamented in a post-war interview, "and replaced it with guilt." Tokyo University Oral History Project, 1953. The American engineers and medics who made those rescues possible returned home quietly, their names lost amid parades for generals and aces. Yet their inventions, the mobile refrigeration units, the FM radios, the portable surgical kits, would seed the technologies of the Cold War. In 1947, former Army engineer Charles E. Jones patented a lightweight field compressor based on the same systems used in Luzon's mobile hospitals. It would later power radar cooling systems in Korea, U.S. Patent Office Archive, 1947. The war's compassion had inadvertently fueled the machinery of the next conflict. The psychological residue of those moments lingered across both nations. In Japan, captured nurses and clerks faced public shame. Many concealed their pasts for decades, fearful of accusations of cowardice or disgrace. A few emigrated to America, where their fluency and training earned them quiet lives as nurses in California and Hawaii. One such woman, identified in post-war records as Lieutenant Aki Sato, became a surgical assistant at a veterans hospital near San Francisco. Colleagues described her as gentle, precise, and endlessly patient. Few knew that she had once served the emperor. Veterans Administration Personnel Record, 1958. In the United States, the images of rescued Japanese women surfaced occasionally in archival compilations, their presence confusing audiences used to simple narratives of good and evil. For some veterans, those memories softened the bitterness of the Pacific War. For others, they deepened it, reminding them of the horror and moral complexity that defined their generation. Strategically, the lessons of those rescues extended beyond moral satisfaction. The American military had proven that logistical superiority was not just about fuel or ammunition. It was about sustaining life under any condition. That realization shaped doctrine for decades. In Korea, the MASH units, Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, were direct descendants of the Luzon system. They used similar collapsible tents, sterilizers, and refrigerated plasma. Army Medical Department Historical File 1951. By the Vietnam era, the philosophy of humane engagement and rapid medical response had evolved into what the Pentagon called the logistics of compassion. The same ideas that saved Japanese POWs on Luzon informed the evacuation of wounded soldiers by helicopter. Each act of rescue, each stretch of steel and canvas designed to preserve life, became part of America's moral arsenal. Department of Defense Medical Policy Review 1967. For Japan, the psychological impact was more subtle yet profound. The nurses who had survived captivity often became advocates of peace, their silence breaking only in the 1970s as documentaries and oral histories began to surface. Their recollections portrayed the Americans not as conquerors, but as engineers of morality, people who turned machinery into mercy. "We were taught they were monsters," said one former nurse in a 1975 interview, "but they were human, and that was harder to face." NHK War Memories broadcast, 1975. The long arc of history transformed that morning on Luzon into something larger than a rescue story. It became a parable of modern war, the collision between ideology and infrastructure, hatred and logistics. Those Japanese nurses, once terrified captives, became witnesses to the birth of a new kind of warfare, where power was measured not just in bullets or bombs, but in the ability to preserve the enemy's life. By the 1980s, scholars began linking these early humanitarian acts to the evolution of network-centric warfare, the idea that speed, information and coordination could achieve dominance with less destruction. The very same FM radios that once coordinated medical evacuations in Manila became the ancestors of digital battlefield systems. Rand Military Systems Analysis 1983. The ghost of those wartime nurses hovered over every technological leap, a reminder that compassion too could be engineered. As the century turned, Japan and the United States had become allies, their militaries sharing training programs, field medicine protocols, and disaster response systems. In 2011, after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, American and Japanese medics worked side by side under Operation Tomodachi. Among the translators was the granddaughter of one of the rescued nurses from Luzon. She later told a reporter, "My grandmother once saw American soldiers through barbed wire. I see them through friendship." Yomiuri Shimbun interview, 2011. 80 years after the war's end. The moral echo of that forgotten camp still lingers, a testament to how the smallest gestures can outlast empires. The Japanese female POWs who couldn't believe their eyes in 1945 had, without realizing it, glimpsed the blueprint of a future world order, one built not just on conquest, but on the machinery of compassion. As the camera of history fades on that scene, the sun breaking through tropical clouds, exhausted women weeping beside armored trucks, and soldiers offering canteens instead of bayonets, the narrator's voice returns, solemn and enduring. In war, the strongest weapon is not always made of steel. Sometimes it is mercy carried on wheels, powered by engines, guided by the hands of those who refuse to hate, dramatized composite. And with that, the story of those women once forgotten, now immortalized in film reels and faded reports, stands as a quiet monument to the truth every generation must rediscover. That even in the darkest hours of human conflict, compassion can move faster than destruction.